They are making more money than it's cost them to stay in operation, and they are in sustainable disequilibrium.
Hey, just you're about to hear a great interview with Doug Hawthorne, and I wanted to just create a little intro because I want you to think about this because we talked about hypernomics, and I want to give you a perspective of this that we didn't think about it until after the show, so I decided to add this intro and ask yourself this: what if you didn't know the laws of supply and demand existed? How would you behave? Now, that begs the question, well, what is supply and demand? So let me give you a quick explanation. I think this will help create the context for the show. So supply and demand is the fundamental concept in economics that explain how prices and goods are determined in the market. So imagine you're a farmer where apples are being sold. The supply refers to the quantity of the apples and they sell at different prices. For instance, if the price of apples is very high, more farmers might be motivated to bring the apples to market, increasing the supply. On the other hand, if the price is low, fewer farmers choose to sell their apples. And so there's a decrease in supply. So now let's talk about demand. This represents the quantity of apples that buyers are willing to purchase at different prices. If the apples are cheap, think housing. So I want y'all to relate. I'm not talking about apples here, okay? Then more people might want to buy them, increasing the demand. If apples are expensive, houses are expensive, few people might be interested in buying them, decreasing the demand. The interaction between supply and demand determines the equilibrium of price and the quantity of apples sold. Okay, so when the supply and demand are balanced, the meaning of the quantity the farmers want to sell match the quantity the buyers want to buy, you reach an equilibrium, and the equilibrium price are where sellers are happy to sell and buyers are happy to buy. Okay, so there is a demand. It's like a seesaw, okay, where one side goes up, the other side goes down. And so finding that balance is determining the price of goods. So I want to say that because what we're going to do is in this interview, we're going to challenge that notion. But I think you need to have a fundamental of economics. As Jim Rohn says, economics is major. Enjoy the show. All right, guys. Hey, let's get into this. Welcome to another episode of the Practical Wealth Show. And today we're going to talk about hypernomics and learning to think in 4 dimensions when it comes to money. I don't even understand it, but we're going to learn today together. And I have Mr. Doug Howarth. So he's the discoverer of hypernomics with a book, Doug, that came out on the same name just recently, right?
It's right over there, over my shoulder.
Over the shoulder for y'all watching, yeah. Right? And he's the first patent and CEO of Hypernomics Inc. He's the author, and is basically using hidden dimensions to solve unseen financial problems. Okay, mm-hmm. So Doug, tell them a little about yourself, your journey, and what got you to this point.
Okay. Well, I went to school in economics, and I learned about the law of supply and demand. And for those of you that have studied it, you know that it talks about an upward sloping supply curve and a downward sloping demand curve, and they intersect at one point. Yeah, you know, that might work pretty well for something like iron ore. There might be one price worldwide for iron ore, but iron goes into cars. Mm-hmm. I think we all know there's more than one price for a car. It also goes into washing machines. And I got the idea for hypernomics. And hypernomics is well, most words are made up, so this made up word, but
Made it work.
the prefix hyper, one of the definitions means existing in more than three dimensions.
Mm,
So hyper and then nomy, Nomy, is a field of study. So hypernomics is a field of study that starts out in more than three dimensions. So we start with four. And I got the idea watching my wife buy a washing machine.
okay.
And so we rolled up to a big box store. I've been a whole bunch of stores one day, and we're rolling up, and we stopped to the come up in front of the washing machine. She's going on and on about washing machines and what she wants to have. And I decided I'm going to really concentrate on what she wants. So she comes up to the machine. One of the machines that we're looking at, she says, I like this machine. It's got more capacity than we have at home. And I thought capacity versus price, that's what we call a two-dimensional problem.
Okay.
And then she says, I've only got one delicate cycle back home. I'd like to have some more. In fact, I'd like to have a lot more cycles. And I thought, cycles versus price. She's up to a 3D problem. And so we like this particular machine. And of course, these product lines just go on. And so there's another machine, same brand, just a little bit bigger, a little bit nicer. I asked her I said, what about this one? And she said, it's too expensive. We can't afford it. And I realized that we were part of a group of people that were going to actually buy a unit of this machine, the one that we just looked at.
Mm-hmm.
And that quantity was going to push a little dot that was representing the quantity versus the price over the course of a year for this particular machine. And so now we're into a four-dimensional problem. She's looking at capacity, cycles, price, and we're part of the quantity thing. So it turns out that she was solving this four-dimensional problem in her head.
Wow.
And then I looked around the room, this is a big, it's a Best Buy. And I realized that everybody in every department that was looking at everything that was in the store was doing the same thing. And so what I did was I went out and figured out a way to plot in four dimensions. And it sounds complicated, but basically it looks like just a T is the plotting system. It looks like there's a back wall to this thing, and then there's a wall that comes out. And we just plot everything in this T structure. And it works out that every market we've looked at behaves in four-dimensional fashion after it starts to mature. And so what's happening here, Curtis, is that people start to self-aggregate their behaviors. They all behave collectively the same way within a certain boundary. Just like that like human height, just like when you walk into a room, if you knew the room was going to be all men, you'd say the chance of anybody being less than 5 feet or over 7.5 feet is really thin.
Right.
And then if you were going to a room that was all women, you'd say, well, I can take that down about 4 inches. And I said, nobody's going to be under 4'8" very likely, and nobody's going to be over 7 feet. And then if you said to yourself, well, I'm going to be in a room full of NBA centers, well, then all of a sudden your distribution shifts. That everybody's going to be taller. Well, it turns out that people categorize products the way that life categorizes humans. There's a certain collection of heights and weights that people have,
Mm-hmm.
and people kind of aggregate to these distributions, and they do the same thing when they buy things. And so that knowing this lets us go out and find out what things are worth. And this gets back to what your issue is here. What are things worth? And they're worth what people say they're worth in the aggregate. But now some people, this is where the technology comes in. Some people overvalue products and some people undervalue products. So
Mm-hmm.
famously, there was a businessman from Microsoft. He was the 7th employee at Microsoft. He decided to come down to Albuquerque, New Mexico, and build himself a business jet. And he said, well, I'm going to build business jets like I build computers. And so he starts to say, I'm going to sell this business jet. It's going to hold 5 people, go 430 miles an hour, and got this range. I'm going to sell this business jet for $775,000. Well, the problem was the jet, if you do the analysis, and we did, he says it's worth closer to $2.2 million. Now, what would happen if you owned a house, a rental,
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
and the identical structure across the street costs 2.2 million, and you decided to sell yours for 775,000, what would happen?
It would. Your neighbors would be mad at you first, but
Right.
right, but it would sell really fast, right?
It would
Because
really sell
yeah,
fast.
it
Yeah.
would be a discount in their
Yeah.
mind. It's a deep discount.
It's a discount. Yeah. And so what happened was this guy get all these orders, and then it turned out he couldn't get the cost below the price, and he ended up going. This whole affair went belly up on him, and it's because he didn't understand what the thing was worth. So
Oh, right. What
he
it
under
needed to cost to manufacture it, he was underestimating that. You know,
yes, he was
it's fun.
underestimating
Before
that.
we go there, you know what I thought about? So
Yeah.
this is nerdy. You can help me nerd out a little bit. So I'm a student of so one of the recommended reading I give our clients is Economics in One Lesson by
Yeah.
Henry Hazlitt. So I started studying more of the Austrian stuff about 20 years ago.
Sure.
And Ludwig von Mises, because this kind of speaks to that point of human action, right? So,
Right.
right, because it's what everybody in that room was solving fourth dimensional problems. So, what people typical is like top down thinking, central planning, but
Hmm.
really what drives everything is you and I at the you and me level making
Exactly.
making decisions of what to do with our scarce resources.
You're exactly right, Curtis, and that's exactly what people do. But just like anything else, people can make boo-boos,
Hmm.
So,
Hmm.
so there, I gave you an example of somebody undervalued a project, famously an overvalued project. Most of the people listening are probably older than, well, not as old as I am, but they may remember, if they don't remember the DeLorean automobile and the DeLorean production, they might remember Back to the Future. And if you saw
Yes,
Back to the
Lord, yeah.
Future, you saw a DeLorean there, which was this really spacey looking car that came out in 1982 or three. I forget what year it was. And so DeLorean built this car in Ireland, and he thought, well, the style will help sell this, and the style is part of it. And what he did was he went ahead and priced this car at the equivalent of $25,000 back in the day. But it turned out that it had about half the horsepower that it needed. People liked horsepower in sports cars, and it had roughly half the horsepower it needed to support that price. And so he had overvalued this product, and he actually overbuilt this product. And so what he ended up doing is he sold only a fraction of the cars that he built, and he too went bankrupt. Now he went
Hmm.
bankrupt because he overvalued something. The other guy went bankrupt because he undervalued something. And it turns out you can also go bankrupt if you don't understand what the demand limit is.
Hmm.
So that's another thing that we solve for. So there's yet another business jet maker. It was Arion. It was going to be built out of Reno, Nevada, which is about 400 miles north of where I'm sitting right now. This guy decided he's going to build a supersonic business jet. The world hadn't had a supersonic business jet. We're going to make one, and it sounded great. And he came up with a cost for it, and we looked at the cost. And the cost seemed reasonable, and then he came up with a price for it. And actually, we could come up with ways to support the price. But what he didn't study was the demand. And it turns out that if you pull all the histories for how many of these planes, business aircraft sell, anything from a nice turboprop up to an airliner, it turned out that there's a what they call a demand frontier that was forming. It was the outer edge of what was possible. And so he wanted to sell 300 of these guys in a decade. And it turned out when he launched in 2014, that frontier said he could build 47 instead of the 300. And so he launched with just 20 orders. And then 5 years later, he still had just the 20 orders.
Hmm.
So I put a post up on LinkedIn. I said it's worth every penny. There's not enough pennies in the world for this thing to be viable. So I got an angry response from one of the guys that worked there who claimed that they had this big order come in. He didn't say that it was all for options, which basically means that if you build it and flies, you passed FAA certification, then we'll buy it. He didn't say that. He just said we had this order come in, and the order was, if everything got converted, he might have had 93 orders total. But
Okay.
still, that's far away from the 300. I said, well, good for you. You're not going to make it. I put his chances of making it at 1 in 40. And they went bankrupt 6 months later.
I could see how that would be important for my business to to know that.
Exactly. Right.
How let me ask you this, what's the, and you might have done it, but I want to bring it down, is
Sure.
how does hypernomics differ from traditional economics in your mind?
Well, traditional economics likes to imagine that there's a sloping demand curve,
Hmm.
one downward sloping demand curve, and there's an upward sloping supply curve. And what we discovered is we have in my book that we describe 6 different ways to take all these little dots to form. So these dots are basically in the supply and the quantity side. You're taking the number of units that are sold of a product as a quantity side, and then the vertical axis would be the price. So you could plot that just like being north and south on a north, south, east, west on a map. You could plot that, and it turns out that there are 6 different ways to plot that. There's what we call an outer demand frontier or an upper demand frontier. Then there's an
Hmm.
outer demand frontier. So the upper one represents the price limitations that the market has. An outer demand frontier might represent the how saturated the market is. People don't buy. There's only so many socks in the world, for example, you can sell. You can't keep creating socks infinitely, even though you might have the capacity to do that. There's a certain outer limit. There's a certain minimum limit. People have to have a certain margin between what it is that what they can sell something for and what it costs. And so they need to have there's a margin limit. And then on the inside, there's what we call a production limit, which is to say, again, going back to socks, I could maybe make money if I produce 10,000 socks a year, but I won't make money if I produce 10 socks a year. And so what we discover is all these dots kind of form, again, the
Hmm.
viable quantities and prices for something. They form kind of typically an elliptical form shape, kind of looks like a big huddle. They kind of huddle these quantity price points kind of huddle like if you were to look at Arctic penguins, they kind of huddle in an ellipse if you were to look down on them. And the market huddles in an elliptical form virtually everywhere we see it. So, for example, if you were to plot the quantity of stocks, the total number of stocks issued on one axis and plot the price on the other, and you take what we call the logarithmic scaling of that, so you put everything in factors of 10, and you plot that for any day of the year, you'll see there's an elliptical shape form, with one exception. Amazon's way out at the top.
Okay.
But everybody else is behaving according to this collective way of valuing things and how much money people have to pay for it and how many can be sold. And so that's
Because
kind of what we
stock
discovered.
is, is a market, right? So really,
Yeah.
ultimately, something's worth what somebody else is willing to pay for it.
Exactly. And that's the whole point is we
Yeah.
try to figure out what things are worth based on what other people have paid for it. And so one of the differences between what we could now call modern economics and hypernomics is hypernomics likes to take the distant past for a product, the near past, and the present to project the near future. So we take the distant past, something that might have happened 2 or 3 years ago, the
Hmm.
near past, yeah, maybe half that time again,
Hmm.
right now, and then being able to predict what's going to happen in a quarter from now, and that or a quarter or a year or something like that. So that's what we're trying to figure out where
See, I
the market.
love short-term goals like that because I,
Oh
I
yeah,
teach
yeah,
clients to think I want, like, even with cash flow management, one of the things we talked about, Doug, is, but I want people to project like the next quarter, 2 quarters, 6 months. Like, I don't, it's too many things going on that I don't think, and this is what my challenge with typical financial planning is, because it makes
right,
too many assumptions about
sure,
markets, about rates, about inflation. It is basically make it up, right?
right,
And so
exactly.
I
Good guess.
right. And so let me ask you this. So now I want to bring this down to um household. So how can
Sure.
um hypernomics may help me or help my listeners in making household economic decisions? Can you so I want to kind of drag a correlation, because really wealth or money is really about how you think. When problems hit
Hmm.
you, what is your, what I call your philosophy? What are your principles that help you with your decision making process? And so I'm seeing that this is a, people don't even realize, people I'm sure are solving four-dimensional problems the way you described it every day, all day, every
Yep.
time, and so how, so that was one, I want to set that up. I want to make sure they're hearing what you're about to answer.
Right. So people are solving these problems, but some people are solving the problems intuitively very well. So, for example, I'd say somebody that solves 40 problems in his head great in a great way is Elon Musk. Solves all kinds of 40 problems.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
I mean, he solved the electric car market. He's solving with Starlink the satellite needs. He's solved for space travel by making the rockets reusable. He's solved for a lot of this stuff in his head. But for ordinary people like you and me, what you may want to do is you may want to start to do an assessment. So, for example, a lot of your people like to buy rental properties, and you may get wrapped up in looking at a single rental property that you looked at and it looks really good. And what you can do intuitively without having to do the math is you can say, well, I see this one and it looks nice, and they want to charge me so much for it. But what I really want to do is I want to go out and see what's in that neighborhood, what's being charged.
Mm-hmm.
And maybe, if this has got like an income level that's too high or too low for me, maybe I want to check out the neighboring communities to see where the incomes are higher or lower, depending on my preference, and see what they have, and then try to figure out what to do. So, for example, maybe you think as a real estate investor, I'm going to buy one really expensive property, and you're kind of shopping around for it. Well, you might want to ask yourself, do you want to buy one expensive property, or would it be better for you to buy two less expensive properties for the same amount, for
Mm-hmm.
the same amount that total up to
Mm-hmm.
the big one?
Mm-hmm.
And so what you need to do is to try to figure out the margins that you would have at the high rate and the low rate. And then you need to figure out where the best area is to purchase this stuff. Now, I can give you an interesting example about this here in the United States, not too far from where you are in New Jersey, in
Mm-hmm.
Alpine, New Jersey. So it's about you're sitting in Philly, so this would be about 100 miles northeast of where you're sitting right now.
Okay.
Town called Alpine, New Jersey. Alpine, New Jersey is this pretty rich enclave. It's on the Hudson River. And it's about 25 miles north of downtown Manhattan. And so it's become this really expensive enclave. And this one guy decided to build a mansion, and it was very beautiful. And it had, I think, 30,000 square feet in it. And it was called Stone Mansion. And he put it on the market for $68 million in 2010. Now, our analytics, this is kind of what we do, is we took all the other properties for sale in that area, and most of them were at least 5 million, and some were as many as 25 million or 30
Mm-hmm.
million.
Mm-hmm.
Took all the other properties in that area, and we figured out what it was worth using the software that we have in our techniques, and we came up with the estimate that it was worth 25.3 million. So he's holding this property from 2010 to 11 to 12 to 13. Rolls around about 2018, I think it was. He drops the price to 39 million. Still doesn't have a taker. And so finally, last year, he sells it for about $27 million, which is pretty close to what we predicted 12 years before that. But what he ended up doing, and he never had anybody sitting in the house, so he's paying these massive real estate
Oh,
taxes
wow.
and
Okay.
all
Yeah.
this maintenance, holding this property, imagining that there's somebody in the world that's going to love this property enough to be way out at the tail of the data there to actually pick this thing up. And so he was banking on the fact that somebody in the world would want this property because, well, it was beautiful, but it wasn't worth $68 million. It was worth what it ended up selling because that was the comparable ones to everybody else
Yeah.
out there.
Yeah.
And so that's an example in the extreme of what can happen. Then another example for commercial real estate out here in LA and of course in Philly and in Pram streets, there's this new concept that came up a while ago. We didn't invent it, somebody else did, but we like it a lot. It's the walkability score. Are you familiar with that? Have you heard that?
Mhm, I heard it. I heard the term walkability of the or
Yeah. Well, it
mhm,
turns out that there's this one outfit very cleverly worked out the walkability score for any series of properties in a bunch of densely packed urban areas. And
mhm,
so it turns out here in I'm not far from Los Angeles. If you go down to Los Angeles and you work out the areas that have, say, a $100,000 household income, you take all the properties there, and then you plot in the middle of this thing, you plot the value for $100,000 household income, and you take a 10,000 square foot house or property, I should say, this is commercial property, and say, well, what's it worth? Well, it turns out that if the walkability score, it goes from 0 to 100, 100
mhm.
being best. If your walkability score was 49, that property might be worth $4 million. But if it's 98, it's worth just a little bit more than double that. And so that's another consideration that you have to do when you start to look at properties is, how close is this to the services that people might want to have? If it's closer to the services, it's worth more. And so you might be able to get a deal if you had two comparable properties and one had a walkability score of 30 and another one at 60. After you did the math and you figured out, oh, I can buy the one at 60, it's a 10% premium, but it's actually worth an extra 30%, depending where you are.
Yeah.
Well, that becomes a much better deal. And so you could buy the one that's more expensive and retrieve more money for it because it's easier for people to live in that place.
I can see that. I see that like I'm that just being able to analyze, like financial literacy is really accounting. The numbers tell a story. And so
Sure.
what I'm hearing is that you can, there's a Frederick Bastiat has a statement and the seen and the unseen of
Yes.
economics, right?
Hmm.
And so this a lot of people, even the unseen stuff, things like opportunity costs, those are real things, but they're
Sure.
unseen. And so as you can develop your vision to to see what other people don't see, I that seems like 'cause you want to make money, you need to have a competitive advantage. And like so, for example, as I'm hearing this, I'm going, oh, okay, this is and maybe talk about some of the industries where this could really help. But like I develop what you described, I'm thinking of developers I know
Sure. Hmm.
that would help them price your stuff because I think there's more uh priced elasticity at the top of the market. Like, the Rolls Royce and Rolex, all these brands are like printing money, right? Because they're not
Sure.
really experiencing a recession. So you might want to try to figure out how to charge a high price product, because these people
Hmm.
are not, they have the money to do whatever and they'll do whatever they want to do because they want it, even
Right.
more, more so. So if you can kind of cater to that, you could kind of, because if you can increase your margins, it's more profitable, right? And so a lot of people are like trying to be, like Walmart. A friend of mine calls it a entrepreneurism. Did everything on a 35% market. So you got to do a lot of
Right.
volume,
Right.
and it's hard to be the lowest price product. To me, that's a race to the bottom. So I want to be
Sure.
more
Right.
expensive and worth it. Right? So as I'm looking at business,
Yeah. Interestingly, hidden elements. My book's name is Hypernomics, using hidden dimensions to solve unseen problems. And so there's a bunch of problems that people can't see because they hadn't been instructed about how to model that. And it turns out that if you start to think in ways back basically to what you said is, I want to envision something I imagine is important that I don't have a way to see yet. There's got to be
right?
a way for me to see what I haven't seen, so in a way in which I can react to it and use it to my advantage. And that's kind of what we're trying to teach people is how to understand that those things exist and that you
Hmm.
can model them and then you can use them to your advantage.
So how can hypernomics? So because you got a software, you got the book, and then
Yes.
you've got the software. Let's talk about business, right? So how can businesses use to enhance their you kind of gave some examples. So maybe this might be redundant, forgive me, to
Mhm.
enhance their strategy and competitive edge in your mind. So if they're they're doing something now, they engage with you, read this book, and it's like, okay, this will help us blank.
Right. Well, to get back to your other issue, the other thing you just brought up is some things have a really high margin. So, for example, a Rolex watch, making the guts of a Rolex watch probably doesn't cost a whole lot more than it costs to make a say a Timex watch. Maybe
Right.
it's 5 times as much as a Timex watch, but then it's retrieving 500 times what a Timex watch gets. And so, one of the things that you want to do is you want to compare the added cost for you to add something to a product
Mm-hmm.
versus what we call the added value of that product. And value in our vernacular means the price it'll retrieve based on its features. And so part of what a Rolex retrieves is it retrieves more money because it's actually weighty. It's got a lot of nice metal in it. It may have diamonds in it and things like that. Things that you don't find in your little Timex watch. But if you can start to acquire those diamonds for far less than it's going to take you to set those diamonds in, and that's what a Rolex realizes,
Mm-hmm.
you can start to make money. And what you want to do then is to try to measure what's going on at the top of the market to see, well, is it infinite how much I can make? That I told you with that business jet, it wasn't infinite in the business jet.
Right.
And there are $100,000 watches and there may be $1 million watches, but I haven't heard anybody with $100 million watch. Maybe there's one out in the world someplace, but
Not, they'd be crazy, but okay.
yeah, it'd be crazy. But the point is that you
Somebody
have
would
to get
buy
at the
it
limit.
because there's, you know,
Right,
that's because they can, and just
right, exactly.
some movie star, rapper, whatever. Because I've seen them do incredibly dumb
Right.
things. But anyway, it's another another story. Um, let me ask you this: how do you
Sure.
see Hypernomics uh evolving in the future? I mean, I know you just kind of, well, yeah, it didn't just because the book just came out, but you've been doing this a
Yeah,
while. But how do
right.
you see it evolving and integrating it in the business world? Because and name some of the people that have in different industries that are really using this to get results.
Yeah, well, we see it evolving this way. The publisher is marketing this as a textbook, and the
Hmm.
reason they're marketing it as a textbook, it basically shows that modern textbooks touting the law of supply and demand are largely, I don't know if we should say inaccurate, as so much as not as you know well informed about how markets react as Hypernomics is. Hypernomics is looking at all these different elements that happen in a market, and the law of supply and demand works great for oil prices, gold prices, iron ore prices, but a lot of things are more complicated than that. So this looks at how to solve for problems that are more complicated than just the simple thing that you get from an econ textbook. The other thing you see with an econ textbook, if any of your listeners out there have actually been in a class, you'll typically just see a pair of simple lines drawn, and those lines aren't aren't informed by data. Now, what we discover with real demand analyses, and again, anybody that's out there, you could go you could pull from your TD Ameritrade account or your Schwab account, pull pull a one column of all the quantities of all the stocks that are out there in the S&P 500. And then in the next column, put down their price. And then plot those things in an XY axis and set each axis to logarithmic, because if you don't, it'll just all collect down at the bottom in the corner. And what you'll see is this forms this ellipse I was talking about. And those dots, that is quantity versus price, those 500 dots are the demand.
Hmm.
And it's not a single point. There are 500 companies that are going around just fine. No single point equilibrium. They're all in what we call, we just to slap back at the standard economic model, instead of being in equilibrium, we say they're in sustainable disequilibrium,
Hmm.
which is to say that the price is of the stock is supported by a company that's making more money than it cost them to sell that stock so that they can actually put it out there. They are in a disequilibrium state. They are making more money than it cost them to stay in operation, and they are in sustainable disequilibrium. And that's another distinction that we try to make, is that You've been sold basically a bill of goods. You've been told that things work thusly, and they don't. And this book explains why that's true and shows you how to basically go around that and figure out things for yourself.
See, I love that. I think that I love all forms of disruption, okay, of markets, right? Because I
Right,
think everything is out there as a bill of goods that they've been sold, and
right.
I think that
It's
the
fine. I'm really enjoying this, by the way. So keep going.
it's like because you have to see because what is not taught is critical thinking.
Yes.
And, I've always wanted to know. I was in I grew up in the I was a registered rep, right? And so I lived through 4 crashes, all right?
Wow. Jeez.
And starting with out of college, I first got into I was in the mutual fund business and it was 87,
Oh yeah. Wow, that one.
right?
Jeez, I remember
Then
that.
it
Black
was the
Monday.
yeah, Black Monday, and then it was the start of the first Gulf War market,
I remember that.
and then what else was it? It was another one in 98, and there's Y2K and then 9/11, right? And so my wholesalers were like, well, the market's gonna come back, you know, and I wanted to know why things happen, right? Which led me to the Austrian stuff and then the
Sure.
creature from Jekyll Island. And I started to realize, okay, a lot of these distortions in the market are caused by the Fed, right? So now,
Right.
right? So if you know what you're looking for, you can kind of see the waves forming, right?
Sure.
And
Right.
if you know what's going on, you'll know what to do. And so, and so that's why I think that if you can kind of look at this a different way, it gives you the edge professionally if you can kind of see the unseen, so to speak. Because I think about what you said with the real estate, I as you're saying this, I can think of like a dozen people that are doing these calculations with everything you said right on the top of the head. They'll look at it. I
Right.
got a friend of mine, I'll tell my sorrow on her live, and this wholesaler was like, okay, yeah, I got this property. She knew where it was, she knew the market, she knew what she was willing to pay for it, she knew
Hmm.
what she could get out of it, and she was really to buy it on the spot, sight unseen.
Wow. Yeah, that's great. If you can do
So
that, yeah, that's fabulous. You also asked me another question. I just got a question from a college friend of mine that he was a dentist. He's asking about how this might work in the field of medicine. And just
mhm.
to prove out that this techniques might work in other fields, I was challenged a while ago to see as the COVID pandemic hit, people asked me, said, well, how can you use this for COVID? And it turns out that the virus has a different kind of market. Now, when you and I are talking markets, usually we're thinking about the thing we might be solving for is dollars, right? What's COVID solve for? You got to sit there and critical thinking. What is COVID solving for? Well, COVID wants to have more COVID, which means it
Mm,
wants to have more cases.
right.
So what I did was I plotted all the infection rates in all the countries for which I could gather data back in, I think it was April or May of 2020, just as the pandemic was ramping up. And it turned out that if you plotted, again, cases being on this vertical axis, so we plotted the population density on one axis. And as you might guess, the denser the population of a country, the more likely it is to have more infections. Basically, people are around next to people and they get infected.
Right.
Made a lot of sense. But what didn't make intuitive sense right off the bat, and this is what you start testing for, is you take as many variables as you can find. It turned out that the countries that were relatively wealthy, had more per capita income, were also experiencing more COVID. Now, why was that? Well, then going back to critical thinking, the countries that have more money were traveling more often and they're being put into contact with more people that could have disease. And so we think that this will have some impact in that field of, immunology. We think too that, for example, if I can tell you're very fit, you work out. Imagine using this for the Tour de France. So instead of the objective function being dollars, what you're trying to do is put out watts
Mm,
as an athlete if you're a Tour de
mhm,
France rider. And it turns
mhm.
out if you start to study these guys are amazing athletes. Some of these guys can put out 1,500 watts, about 2 horsepower for about 20 seconds.
Hmm.
And some of the same riders then can produce 150 watts for 6, 7, 8 hours in a row, just continuously cranking. Well, so there's a demand curve, we would argue, in the cycling world for watts per day by
Right.
rider.
Right.
And then what does it take to produce the watts? Well, you have to have a certain amount of muscle, and you can maybe plot muscle mass on one axis. And then, as I think we saw with the scandals that they had for blood doping, the ability to transport oxygen.
Right.
So what's your hemoglobin count or your red blood cell count? If it's really high and your muscle mass is high, you're probably going to be able to generate more horsepower than somebody that's starting to approach anemia and doesn't have the same kind of muscle mass. And so it'd be probably possible to, if you're a exercise physiologist, to train your athletes to be able to put out the maximum amount, and then over time to actually figure out how to parse their energy so that they would have the best burst at the end of a race if they
I can
needed.
see that. Like I'm was a little bit familiar with that, and being the I always when in middle school studying training, what people ate, aerobics, that.
Hmm.
And so I could, because I'll look at that, I'll go, okay, in business, it's like, all right, because like a lot of people say, well, I want to make X amount of transactions, right? But I always tell
Sure.
people, you can't focus on the transaction. You have to focus on the activity, the
Hmm.
lead generation,
Sure.
the can you do that? Can you get better at communicating your message? Do you follow up? I
Sure.
mean, there's a lot of variables to that with everything, even with the COVID thing. It's like, because I interviewed this
Sure.
doctor, right? So it's the wealth, it's the diet, it's the part of the country that they're in, it's the age, right? Because he told me that most of the people that got it were older because they were
Right.
I forget the word, but they're basically their
Bone
what's the
density was low.
bone density was weak, and that's where the white blood cells count come
Right.
from,
Sure. Right.
right?
Right.
So there's a lot, and a lot of times you're not looking at all that stuff. So I'm sorry, you're hearing me nerd out on stuff.
No, it's great. I'm digging it. Keep going.
So, and I don't know what this has to do with money. I'm just fascinated, right? So,
No, it's all the same thing. It's basically people, organisms. I mean, so we were
mhm,
talking about humans, but
mhm, mhm,
that COVID virus, it's solving for things too.
mhm.
And then it tries to. I mean, look at all the strains that we've got now. It's evolving to try to outsmart us, and we have to try to outsmart it. So the same thing will happen in the markets. People will start to build things that people want, and then people say, "Oh, people want that," so then they try to compete with it. Then the market gets crowded in a certain area, so somebody's got to figure out a way to go out and try to separate themselves. So part of what this hypernomics does is these little points that we're talking about, again, the quantity versus the price,
Right.
or on the value side, it might be how much horsepower and range, let's say, electric car has versus its price. These points, if it's horsepower, range, and price in an electric car, it's like latitude, longitude, and altitude in a physical plot. And so you
Mhm.
can imagine all these points being plotted physically, and you can look down on this and say, "Oh, there's an area in here between this horsepower range and this horsepower range," which back in 2013 nobody was building a car that had between 300 and 500 horsepower. Now we have lots of cars now that do that, but back in
Right.
2013 there wasn't a single car that had 300 to 500 horsepower. And Tesla had managed to get a couple of cars around 250 miles of range, but there were a lot of cars that were down in the 80-mile range. So if you could have come up with a car that had 200 miles of range, 500 horsepower, well, you've separated yourself from a wide variety of potential competitors. And so this is also a mapping kind of function. It forms a way to see what your economic distance is from somebody else.
Okay. If
Yeah.
I'm studying this, let's say, let's just get the book. What are maybe a couple of main takeaways or insights readers can expect to? You've already named a few of them. I just want to make sure that I want to have it in a bite-sized thing where they can find it. What are the main insights you see them taking away? And then I want you to tell them how to follow you and find out more about what
Okay.
you're doing.
Well, the main thing is that what you've been told about the traditional law of supply and demand is only works for a very small subset of what you're going to see. And it turns out that your intuition about what things are worth is probably spot on. Now, this book gives you the tools to take your intuition and then crank it into a model. I mean, we would suggest our software. You could do this in an engineering model. I
Mhm.
actually first plotted this in an engineering model that I created for myself. But it gives you the ability to actually model this stuff for yourself so that you can try to make distinctions for your whatever it is that you're trying to invest in. It's going to tell you that, oh, there's not just one single element of demand. There's an upper region, which is price limited. There's an outer region, which is saturation limited. There's a lower region, which is margin limited. There's an inner region, which is quantity limited. And it also tells you how to do analysis by proxy. So for example, if you wanted to predict the total number of shares, how the whole stock market was doing, the total number of shares outstanding, you could do that from the volume. If you take the volume, it turns out to be a proxy for the entire stock market. So there's ways to model this if you only got a part of the data. And
Could you
then you
model this from a macro or even a local level with, for example, a inefficient market like real estate?
Oh yeah, we've done it for real estate. In fact,
Okay.
we modeled the in one of our classes that we gave, we modeled the difference between real estate and two coastal communities. So we looked at Stratford, Connecticut,
Mm-hmm.
which is on the Atlantic coast, and we compared it to Montecito, California. That's where Oprah lives.
Mm-hmm.
On the West Coast. And it turned out that we could figure out that the value of the house was a function of the square footage, as you can imagine, and the property size, the acreage. But then it also had to do with the wealth in the town. So if the average wealth was higher, well, the houses would be priced higher. So Stratford didn't have the income that Montecito did. So the Montecito houses were uniformly more pricey. And then there's also the ability to get close to the beach. So, of course, if you're having beach erosion now, that's maybe not a great thing. But
Mm-hmm.
it turns out the closer you get to the beach, there's this tremendous ramp up. Being right on the beach pays for a lot. And if you go just across the street, there's a pretty big fall off. And then the further you get away from that, the less the property's worth. So interestingly here, if you were to remember one time I did this decades ago, I took a run from Santa Monica Beach in the summer. So here in California, there can be a 30 to 40 degree difference between being at the beach and being inland. So I ran from the beach up into the middle of this is from Santa Monica Road, basically ran east into town. And by the time you get about 5 miles away from the beach, the temperature's up 15, 20 degrees.
Wow.
And so the closer you get to the beach, the more the temperature's more narrowly regulated. So you don't get the extreme highs, you don't get the extreme lows. So that's people like to live in comfortable climes, and so that's something else that you could model for yourself with this.
Huh. Okay. So
Yeah.
I like being able to break numbers down a different way, and it's interesting. So ideally, if we're putting this out there, who um how do I ask this? Who's your ideal? Well, you have a bunch because economics, markets, aerospace, business strategy, market analysis. You have a lot of. It's a broad thing. Process helps people solve for. If I'm listening to this, who should be reaching out to you? Everybody should be buying the book, but ideally, who would make an impact where you're like, hell, this you need to get with us.
Well, if you're, I was an analyst at a large company, and one of the things, I mean, I left the company because I wanted to pursue my own ideas here. But one of the things I kept seeing this company do time and time again is they chase some idea that would not come to fruition. So Dr. Clayton Christensen out of Harvard once wrote, he says 95% of all new product ideas fail. That seems pretty reasonable to me.
Mm-hmm.
So I got to thinking, well, what if you could go from, that's the other way of looking at it is 5% of the products that you might start succeed. Well, what if you could take the 5% from up to 6%? Well, it doesn't sound like much, but that's a 20% improvement.
Mm-hmm.
And so the
Mm-hmm.
idea we have is that we'd like to have people apply the software to their product ideas to help refine what it is that they're doing so they don't make some of those mistakes that we've been talking about here going forward. So we think it's going to help students. I mean, again, it's going into universities. I don't know if it's going to be standard practice in 3 years from now, 5 years, or 10, but I
Mm-hmm.
do know that 20 years from now, you're not going to be taught supply and demand all the way through a semester. It's going to be an artifact, kind of like the the Ptolemaic system of the universe. Ptolemy thought that the Earth was at the center of the universe, and he created a system to show that.
Mm-hmm.
Then Copernicus and Galileo said, no, that's really not the way it worked. And so you might understand Ptolemy's system just to see it for reference, but you're not going to be able to look at the law of supply and demand decades from now and say that it had anything useful to say about the economy. It was just something somebody did. So students are going to need this. Business analysts, that's what I was, stock analysts, executives may not want to understand all of it, but they're going to have people that can apply this to their own businesses.
Right.
Real estate investors. Quite frankly, we haven't discovered too many regions in which this stuff doesn't work. So we're just a small company, and we're trying to spread the word here. But we think pretty soon the word will become more ubiquitous, and lots of people will do this. And we see this. You're talking about the ups and downs in the stock market. Well, the last two crashes of the stock market, if you take the 2007, 2008 crash, that was due largely to people incorrectly reporting that these combined mortgage pools were worth. So they were overrating that, A, and B, they were putting people into mortgages that shouldn't have them.
That shouldn't have them in the first place. That's right.
and had some company actually positively reported on that, and that report was widespread, people would say, you know what, I'm not going to give you this house because you don't have the income from it, and I'm not going to buy this mortgage package because you guys are over reporting that. So this big run up that happened, and then the crash, well, we think that's going to start to be dampened. And the same thing happened when COVID. I'm sure that you were talking about the Fed. I mean, the Fed, for those of you who didn't catch this when they were doing it, they actually tried to hide it for a while. They took down their site. The Federal Reserve Bank in St. Louis tracks the money supply. And you're nodding because I know you know this, Curtis. They took this money supply up 400%, 4 times in 2 quarters. Completely unprecedented. So all this inflation that we're suffering right now.
Right. See, that is inflation, right? See, people said,
right.
Prices are a result of monetary inflation, right?
Exactly.
So, I mean, if you print all this money, where the hell you think it's going to go? I mean,
exactly.
And so, I mean, when you understand economics, you see that, right? And you know they're not telling you the complete truth, right? And so, don't get me started. You're not getting me hyped now. We're trying to close.
Right. Yeah. But all these principles apply.
Yeah.
In the book, there's a section that shows what happened pre-COVID that was showing how the money supply worked in countries. And basically, the more you print, the less it's worth. Imagine that.
Right. So what you see as higher prices is actually the purchasing power dropping.
Yes.
When you see it, and they were trying to hide it with what? Smaller packaging, right?
Yeah, exactly.
You see it in commodity prices, oil, kind of gold and silver, but they suppress that, right? Because that's a natural indicator. And so that's what I mean. You got to kind of see the forest through the trees. And so anything, Doug, that will help you kind of make accurate decisions.
Right.
Because that's the thing. You have to, one of the tenets of Think and Grow Rich guy, Napoleon Hill, right?
Oh, yeah, that's right.
This is the least favorite of people when they look at the laws of success. One of them is accurate thinking.
Sure. Yes, exactly.
And you got to have, and most people have inaccurate thinking. They're going on wishes. They're going on, what they want. People say, well, I have this great idea, but what does the market want? That's
exactly that's what does the market want?
In fact,
our little mantra here, if you want to boil it off to one sentence, we want to figure out, what does the market want?
Mm-hmm.
What do they want, don't have, and can afford?
Just I love that. There you go. I mean, that's the
magic. Don't have and can afford. If you
what
can
does
come
the
up with
market
that,
want, don't have, and can afford. Okay,
right.
That's what you help people solve for. So
exactly.
we should have started with that, right? So
we should have. Yeah, that would have been great.
So that's what I say. I talk long enough, it'll get you down. Just like get warmed up. But listen, I thank you because we so this is fun. We have to maybe now after I hear it again, I'll think of some more questions. I may call you back. All right, Doug, come back on.
Okay.
I got some more questions. But listen, tell them how to find you.
Okay, I've got my company website, which is hypernomics.com. That's hypernomics.com. And then I've got my personal website, Doug Howarth. That's DougHowarth.com. And you could write me, and I'd write the sites, and I'd write you back and tell you, see what you're interested in. We could initiate a conversation.
Okay. And where can I get the book?
The book right now is on sale on Amazon and
Hmm.
Barnes and Noble and Walmart, and also on the Wiley site. So
Everywhere books are sold, you can get them.
everywhere fine books are sold. Yes.
And all right, listen, Doug, thank you so much for I feel smarter today just by being to spend this hour with you today.
Well, I feel energized, Chris. I love your show. You really brought a great energy to the morning here. This has been great. I really
Ah,
appreciate
I'm glad. Listen, I'm a closet nerd, and I'm absolutely fascinated, because one it's a great book called, I forget the name of the author, but it's called The Magic of Compounding, right? And it's the guy
it. Yeah,
studies Buffett and Charlie Munger, right?
yeah, I love
And
those
so what
guys. Yeah,
happens is if you read a lot or do a lot of stuff from varied things, then he called Munger would say it's a lattice work of connections, right? And so
right,
what happens
right.
is you start being able to see something that's over on one side, it does connect over here, and the more you expand your knowledge, you see the connections firing off where most people
Oh
don't
yeah,
see them.
sure,
And so as I'm listening, I'm like, okay, yeah, I'm connecting the dots mentally. That's why I
sure,
get more
right,
excited
right,
at the end
exactly.
here, right? Because I'm starting, oh, I get it. So that's good stuff, man. I appreciate you.
Well, I can't thank you enough for having me on the show, Curtis. It's been a real blast for me. And the thing I would point out, the one overarching idea is to have an open mind. And I mean, you've shown that to me in droves. You don't get to figuring stuff like this out unless you basically uh, come into it with an open mind and throw away your past preconceptions. So I basically threw my economics degree in the toilet and started afresh, and this is what I came up with. So
You gotta have what's Albert Einstein said, imagination
yes,
is key, right? And so
hmm,
you've got to let a lot too many people, even in the financial world, hold on to bad ideas or stuff dogma they've been taught, and they're
right,
not questioning who taught it to them and where this came from. And
yes,
so that's kind of what I try to do in the world. Typical advice
sure,
doesn't work, but here is why are you being taught this? Okay.
hmm,
And then how to question that. So my message is question everything. I just got the phone with a client and said, listen, products that you buy should be a result of your knowledge, not a substitute for it. Right. So
sure, exactly,
and so that's it. You got to have now, and then because products or even software, they're tools, right, of
hmm,
implementation. And so what
yes,
you've done
exactly,
is you've created a thought process, and then you've given them a tool to implement
yes,
the
that's
thought
exactly
process.
right,
And
exactly
so
right.
that's what I'm hearing. And keep up the good work. And so y'all go out there, check out his site, go get the book, and make yourself smarter and make more money.
Thanks, Curtis.
All right. Thank you. All right, guys, go out there and have a great day. Are you ready to take control of your financial future? Hi there. I'm Curtis May, and I'm here to help you achieve your financial goals. Do you want to be the customer bank, or would you like to be the bank? Subscribe to our channel for regular updates, valuable insights from experts in different fields. You know, the name of the game, guys, is cash flow. Okay. You want You can't eat equity. And our goal is to help you build, we call it being a cash flownaire, which is passive income twice your expenses outside of Wall Street, where possible, right? Which is quite possible. And so if you're interested in learning more about our services, here is what I challenge you to do, or I invite you to do, I won't say challenge, is to take our financial freedom quiz. See where you are. Okay. Don't wait any longer to take control of your financial future. Let's begin this journey together.